inspired by the tone and atmosphere of the creator you implied, but without naming them. The town of Briar Hollow had always believed its greatest sin was forgetting. Forgotten promises, forgotten history, forgotten faces carved into fading tombstones. But nothing prepared its people for the morning when 50 children, every single one attending Sunday school that day, simply never walked back out of the chapel. The bell rang, the service ended, and the parents waited with patient smiles that slowly curdled into dread. The door to the old stone building remained closed, its stained glass windows dark, reflecting nothing but the grey sky. The sudden silence after dismissal was the first thing that unsettled the parents waiting outside the chapel. On any other Sunday, the bell was followed by a burst of noise, feet running, chatter spilling from the doorway, laughter skipping down the steps. But this time, when the bell tolled its final note and faded into the cold air, nothing followed it. The parents stood scattered across the small courtyard, wrapped in coats against the brittle wind, holding paper cups of coffee that had long gone lukewarm. Some had younger siblings toddling beside them, tugging at coat sleeves and asking when their brothers or sisters were coming out. Others leaned on parked cars, glancing down at their watches, expecting at any moment to hear the familiar chaos of children pushing through the wooden doors. Instead, there was only stillness, the kind that settles on a graveyard before snowfall. At first, no one panicked. People joked about how the kids must be rehearsing something special, or how the teacher was probably giving them a short lecture about behaving during the upcoming winter festival. Someone laughed and said their son never came out on time anyway, always lingering behind to talk to friends or pick at the snacks laid out on the back table. Ordinary explanations, comforting ones, floated through the crowd like drifting leaves. But beneath them lay something else, an unspoken awareness that the silence was wrong, not the kind that children create when they're behaving, but the kind that happens when they're not there at all. A few parents stepped closer to the building. The chapel stood like an old sentinel, its stone walls blotched by years of rain and moss creeping between cracks. The stained glass windows, vibrant only when sunlight hit them just right, looked dull and lifeless under the grey morning sky. Normally, faint shapes would be visible through them, the shifting silhouettes of small bodies, the teacher's form moving between rows, the soft blur of motion. Today, there was nothing but darkness, as though the room beyond the glass had been drained of its color, or filled with smoke that left no scent. Someone knocked on the wooden doors, a firm rap that echoed too loudly in the quiet. Another parent called out the teacher's name, her voice bouncing weakly off the chapel walls. Still nothing. Not a scrape of a chair, not the shuffle of small shoes, not a single voice calling back. A few of the younger siblings began to grow restless, whining softly or clutching their parents' legs, suddenly anxious without knowing why. Even the wind seemed to hush itself, as if afraid to disturb whatever absence hovered in the air. Minutes dragged on. More knocking. More confused glances. One of the older fathers tried the door handle, expecting it to give, expecting to see 50 mischievous faces grinning back at him. But the handle didn't budge. It felt locked from the inside, though no one could remember the teacher ever locking it during service, not with children inside. A strange heaviness pressed against the door, as if the building itself were holding its breath, resisting the outside world. Inside the parents, fear began to unfurl slowly, like a shadow stretching its limbs. Not terror yet, just a dark, creeping suspicion that slid beneath their ribs. A few whispered to each other, unsure whether to voice what they were thinking. It was ridiculous, of course. Children don't simply disappear. They don't all conspire to stay quiet at once. They don't sit silently in their seats after the bell, not 50 of them, not in Briar Hollow where routine was as predictable as the seasons. And yet, the silence persisted, thickening with each passing moment. A mother stepped forward, Lydia Harris, known in town for her calm demeanor and her daughter's tendency to chatter non-stop after class. She cupped her hands around her mouth and called her child's name sharply, the way a parent does when they sense something is wrong, truly wrong. Her voice rang across the courtyard and seeped into the cracks between the stones, but the chapel swallowed it whole. Lydia's breath hitched, barely noticeable except to those standing near her. Her daughter never ignored her. Not once in 9 years. Then came the moment that shifted the atmosphere from confusion to dread. A faint vibration hummed through the air, subtle enough that most wouldn't have noticed if the world weren't so unnaturally still. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like the suggestion of a sound, a gentle tremor brushing the inside of the ear. Some parents frowned, turning their heads as though trying to locate the source. Others stiffened, feeling the tiny hairs on their arms rise. It lasted only a second, quick as a breath, and then was gone. But it left an imprint in the air, an aftertaste of something cold and unfamiliar. Someone muttered that the children were playing a prank. Someone else snapped back that 50 children couldn't coordinate silence this perfect. Eyes darted between the parents, searching for reassurance and finding none. The older father tried the doors again, putting his shoulder into them this time, and the wood shuddered under the force. The hinges creaked faintly, protesting the intrusion, but still the doors refused to open. A decision formed unspoken among them, a collective tightening of muscles, a shared understanding that they couldn't wait any longer. They didn't know what they feared yet, but they knew they feared something. The last threads of patience snapped one by one, replaced by a primal need to see, to know, to break through whatever barrier stood between them and their children. As the parents prepared to force the doors open fully, their breaths fogging in the chill air, another wave of quiet washed over the courtyard, deeper and heavier than before, as though the chapel itself were listening to their desperation and drawing strength from it. When the search for the missing children began, the initial focus was the chapel itself. People moved through the building in frantic waves, opening supply closets, peering behind old wooden pews, running their hands along dust-layered shelves as though expecting to find small hands reaching back. But the chapel, despite its age and secrets, held no sign of life. No overturned chairs, no dropped notebooks, no scattered crayons or toys. Everything appeared too neat, too undisturbed, as though the children had evaporated between breaths. Once the building had been thoroughly searched and its silence confirmed as absolute, the panic spilled outward into the churchyard and the surrounding properties. Someone shouted that maybe the children had run into the fields behind the chapel, but the brittle grass showed no sign of disturbance. Others insisted the kids must have wandered into the woods, even though they knew children from Briar Hollow had always been warned to stay clear of the forest's edge. A group of men, fathers, uncles, and older brothers, formed an impromptu search line that stretched across the back of the property. They spread out shoulder to shoulder, moving slowly across the uneven ground, eyes lowered, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. The soil was still damp from the previous night's rain, soft enough that any movement should have left impressions. At first they found nothing but fallen leaves, stray twigs, and patches of wet earth. Then someone called out sharply, and the line broke as people rushed toward the sound. There, at the edge of the chapel grounds, a single small footprint pressed into a patch of mud. The shape was unmistakably that of a child's shoe, a narrow, shallow, the tread worn down in places. A murmur ran through the searchers as they clustered around it. One footprint could be a coincidence, the mark of a child who had wandered outside before class or someone who had walked through the area earlier in the week. But then another print was found a few feet away. Then another. Soon it became obvious that a trail of footprints was leading away from the chapel. The relief that briefly flickered through the group was fragile and short-lived. At least they had something tangible, a direction, evidence that the children had walked, not been dragged or carried away. But as they followed the tracks, weaving between patches of grass and dirt, their relief became laced with unease. The prints were too orderly, almost single file at times, as if the children had been walking in a line. Not running. Not scrambling. Not acting like terrified kids trying to escape something. Instead, the footprints formed a pattern that suggested obedience, purposeful movement, or even following someone who knew exactly where they were leading them. As the searchers continued, the trail grew denser. Dozens of tiny shoe prints clustered together in muddier sections of the field, overlapping in strange, spiraling formations. It was as if the children had paused there for a moment, shifting their weight, turning in small circles, before moving forward again. A few of the adults knelt down, pressing their palms to the impressions, feeling the depth of the prints. The rain from the night before had softened the ground, meaning the footprints had to be fresh. Fresh enough that the children had walked across the field that very morning, just minutes before the parents discovered them missing. The trail continued toward the forest, a thick wall of pine and oak trees that loomed like dark sentinels. The forest had always been treated with wary respect by the townspeople. Stories told around dinner tables and late-night gatherings warned of strange sounds, wandering lights, and animals that behaved in ways that defied explanation. Children were strictly instructed never to go near the tree line unless accompanied by an adult, and even then, only for brief outings. The idea that 50 children had voluntarily walked toward it was unsettling enough. But the idea that they had walked calmly, in formation, bordered on impossible. As the searchers approached the forest's edge, voices lowered instinctively. The air seemed different here, cooler, stiller, as though the trees themselves were holding their breath. The line of footprints led straight into the narrow path between the first two towering trunks. The mud was darker here, richer, and the prints were even clearer. Small heels, rounded toes, the faint imprint of laces. But just a few feet beyond the entrance to the path, something unnatural occurred. The trail simply ended. One moment the ground was a tapestry of overlapping prints, and the next it was smooth, untouched earth. It made no sense. The soil was perfect for capturing impressions, soft enough that even a bird hopping across would leave tiny marks. Yet there was nothing, not a smear, not a partial print, not a broken twig. It was as though the children had stepped into the forest and vanished the instant they passed beneath the first veil of shadow. A heavy silence fell over the group as they stared at the abrupt end of the trail. Some speculated that the children had been lifted, but how could 50 children be lifted without anyone hearing or seeing anything? Others whispered about sinkholes or hidden structures, though the ground appeared solid and undisturbed. One of the older men suggested the rain might have washed away the prints, but the edges were crisp, untouched, impossible to reconcile with the idea of erosion. The air inside the forest felt charged, humming faintly with a presence that made the adult skin prickle. None of them wanted to step any further in, but they knew they had no choice. The children had gone somewhere, walked with purpose, and whatever awaited them beyond that point defied anything the townspeople had ever imagined, yet they continued standing at the threshold, staring at the place where 50 small sets of footsteps dissolved into nothingness. The unearthed diary of the former pastor was not discovered immediately. In fact, no one in Briar Hollow even remembered that the chapel once had a pastor before the kindly, soft-spoken woman who currently led the Sunday services. Her predecessor had vanished from the town's memory as effectively as he had vanished from the town itself nearly 40 years earlier. His name had been removed from church records, his belongings disposed of or hidden, and any mention of him faded into half-whispered rumors that older residents avoided repeating. It wasn't until the third day of searching, when the panic had evolved into a heavy, suffocating dread, that the diary surfaced at all. The discovery happened by accident. A group of volunteers, exhausted from combing the forest paths for the 100th time, returned to the chapel for warmth and rest. Tools were scattered across the floor, muddy boots tracked across the stone, and the air inside felt oddly colder than the winter wind outside. Someone leaned against a bookshelf in the back room, a rickety, dust-laden thing that the children rarely approached because it smelled permanently of mold and forgotten paper. When the weight pressed into the wood, the entire shelf trembled and shifted, tilting forward just enough to reveal a gap in the wall behind it. One of the volunteers noticed the sliver of darkness and called the others over. With some effort, they pushed the shelf aside, coughing as a storm of dust erupted from behind it. The wall behind the shelf was not like the others. It was a panel, old, wooden, carved with a faint, almost invisible pattern that looked more decorative than functional. Someone pressed their fingers against the edge of the panel, and it slid open with a soft groan, revealing a shallow compartment. Inside, wrapped in a decayed piece of cloth and resting atop a layer of brittle straw, was a leather-bound book. The cover was cracked, the binding frayed, and the edges eaten away by time. But when the cloth was pulled back and the book was opened, the first page revealed a name written in heavy, deliberate ink. It was the name of the pastor who had served before the current one, a man no one had spoken of in decades. Beneath his name was the date the diary began, a date that instantly sent a ripple through the group. It was the exact year before the pastor's sudden disappearance, an event the older townsfolk had always brushed aside as a retirement, a relocation, or an illness. Yet here, in the pastor's own handwriting, was the first hint that his vanishing had been anything but ordinary. The entry started innocently enough. Conversations about sermons, complaints about church finances, small notes about the children's choir or the maintenance of the chapel roof. But as the days passed, the tone shifted subtly, then drastically. The writing grew faster, the lines slanted, ink pooling heavily in certain words as though the pastor's hand trembled while writing. He began speaking of dreams, recurring visions of children standing in rows, silent and unmoving, their faces blurred or shadowed. He wrote of whispers heard after dark in the chapel, whispers that he insisted were not the wind. He mentioned shapes drifting across the stained glass windows when no one else was inside, shapes that didn't match the figures outside. Then the entries grew stranger still. He wrote about a group he called the Circle of Purity, a small gathering of townspeople who had approached him late at night, urging him to open certain lessons for the younger children. Lessons, they said, meant to prepare them spiritually for a coming event, something sacred and promised long before Briar Hollow was founded. The pastor admitted he initially refused, disturbed by the rituals they described, but the circle was persistent. They left pamphlets, ancient texts written in languages he claimed never to have seen, and symbols carved onto slips of wood that he found slipped under his door each morning. The deeper the pastor delved into these materials, the more his entries became fragmented. He confessed he felt watched, not by people, but by something present only when he was alone. He described waking in the night to the sound of a choir humming beneath the floorboards, even though no such space existed beneath the chapel at the time. He wrote of the circle's pressure becoming unbearable, demanding that he begin the preparation, that he guide the children through rituals disguised as ordinary lessons. The pastor refused repeatedly, recording his refusals with desperate emphasis, insisting he would never allow harm to come to the children. But the entries did not end with defiance. Eventually, they shifted into fear. The pastor wrote of disappearing objects, of blackouts during which he found himself standing in the chapel without recalling how he got there, of waking with mud on his shoes despite locking himself inside his home at night. The circle, he said, had grown bolder. He believed they were entering the chapel after dark, performing rites he could not witness, leaving behind objects he found moved or altered the following morning. He worried that something ancient was being awakened, something the circle revered, and he prayed to resist. The final entry was the most disturbing. The handwriting was jagged, smeared in places as though written in a frenzy. He wrote that the children were being targeted, that the circle intended to use them in the ritual they called the returning. He expressed certainty that something in the woods, something older than the town, older than the church, was listening to the circle's prayers. He ended the entry abruptly, mid-sentence, as though interrupted. No date followed. There were no more pages. The pastor was never seen again, and his absence became just another piece of Briar Hollow's forgotten history, sealed behind a bookshelf until the day 50 children walked into a chapel and never walked back out. The first whispers reported inside the chapel at night came from the volunteers who refused to let exhaustion deter them. After the children vanished, people worked in shifts, refusing to allow the chapel to sit in silence for too long. They moved through the building with flashlights and lanterns, hoping to find some overlooked clue, some scrap of fabric or scribbled note accidentally dropped. But as night folded deeper around Briar Hollow, the building's atmosphere shifted in ways none of them could explain. The sunlight that filtered through the stained glass windows during the day lent the chapel an illusion of warmth and safety, but after dusk, the interior felt hollowed out, as if the darkness had weight and the air had developed a pulse of its own. The first person to hear the whispers was Jacob Mullin, a retired school janitor who had offered to watch the chapel overnight with 2 others. He was used to the noises of empty buildings, pipes groaning, wood settling, wind pressing against windows, but the sound he heard that night defied every familiar pattern. Jacob was organizing a stack of hymnals when a faint hum drifted through the air, so soft he initially thought it was electrical interference or the muffled rattle of a heater. But the chapel had no heaters running, and the lights were powered down to conserve energy. The hum grew into a string of tones, wavering but intentional, like the beginning of a lullaby sung from behind a thick wall. When Jacob lifted his head, the hymnal slipped from his hands, hitting the floor with a thud that echoed through the empty sanctuary. At first, he thought one of the other volunteers was humming to themselves, a nervous tick in the quiet. He called out their names, but the humming didn't stop. Instead, it shifted in pitch, breaking into a series of soft syllables, more like words now, shaped by voices trying to form meaning. Jacob backed away, feeling the chill crawl from the floor up his spine. The whispers didn't come from any one direction. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, as though the air itself were speaking. The sound traveled through the beams overhead, through the pews, through the floorboards, creating a vibration he felt deep in his chest. He rushed to find the other volunteers, who were just as alarmed. One insisted the sound had come from the old storage room near the baptismal font, another swore it was coming from beneath the pulpit. None of the sources matched. The whispers flickered, weaving in and out of hearing, growing louder when the three men moved as a group and quieter when they stood still. When one of them suggested stepping outside to clear their heads, the whispers surged, rising in pitch like a warning or plea. The following morning, Jacob tried to explain what he heard to the rest of the search teams, but his account was dismissed as exhaustion or nerves. Yet the next night, the whispers came again, and this time 2 other volunteers heard them clearly. They described them in different ways. One said they were breathy, like children telling secrets in the dark, while the other insisted they were more rhythmic, like a hymn being sung underwater. But all 3 agreed on 2 things: the whispers were not random, and there were too many voices to count. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed the voices were recordings wired into the chapel decades ago for unknown reasons. Others believed they were the cries of the missing children. A few older residents, whose memories stretched far enough to include fragments of the past the town preferred to ignore, whispered about the forest and things best left buried. No one wanted to believe the voices were real, because that meant confronting a truth they were not prepared to face. Despite growing fear, more people volunteered for the night watches. Curiosity mixed with desperation, and soon the chapel was never empty after sundown. The whispers responded to their presence. Sometimes they grew louder when certain individuals entered, as if recognizing them. Other times they faded into near silence, returning only when the listener's attention drifted. A few volunteers claimed they heard their own children's names spoken softly, urging them to come closer or open the door, though no one could locate the door the voices meant. One of the most unsettling incidents occurred when a group of volunteers stood near the altar, debating whether to lift the old floorboards. The whispers began faint and scattered, then rose into a strange chorus. The sound thickened, gaining texture, becoming urgent. The voices overlapped until their individual tones blurred into a single, undulating chant. The words were indistinguishable, but the cadence was hypnotic. Several volunteers stepped back, feeling an instinctive fear that something was trying to lure them into a specific spot. It was only when one of them tripped over a pew and the noise of his fall broke the moment that the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the chapel into a silence more unsettling than sound. The phenomenon continued for days. The whispers never occurred outside the chapel, never drifted into the street or seeped through the walls during daylight. They existed only within the boundaries of the building itself and only under the cover of darkness. Some volunteers attempted to record them on their phones or handheld devices, but the devices captured nothing except static. Others tried amplifying microphones, placing them along the floorboards, but the whispers always shifted to another corner of the room just as the equipment came close to detecting them. It was as if the voices understood the attempts, as if they played a game that only the chapel walls could witness fully. By the end of the week, even skeptics began avoiding the building at night. They claimed the whispers had changed. They were no longer soft or hesitant. They sounded expectant, almost eager. Those who still entered the chapel after dark claimed that the very walls seemed to breathe when the whispers began, that the stained glass windows flickered as though shadows moved behind them, and that each whisper carried a weight of sorrow so heavy it pressed against their ribs and made their lungs tighten with unspoken fear. The revelation beneath the chapel came only after every other possibility had been exhausted. Search parties had combed the forests until their boots wore thin, helicopters scanned the surrounding hills, and divers explored the river that wound past Briar Hollow like a serpentine shadow. Nothing surfaced. No clothing. No footprints beyond the forest's edge. No clues that could be explained through ordinary means. Every trail ended abruptly, every theory collapsed under its own weight, and the panic that swallowed the town began to change into something more unnerving, acceptance that the answer might lie closer than anyone had dared to look. It was the whispers that pushed them toward the chapel floorboards. For nights on end, they drifted across the sanctuary like breath from invisible mouths, growing louder near the altar, near the old wooden podium, near the cracks between the boards where flickers of cold air rose like exhalations from something buried beneath. Eventually, a group of volunteers gathered with crowbars and lanterns, driven by desperation and the overwhelming sense that the chapel itself was hiding something. Lifting the first floorboard was harder than expected. The wood resisted as though fused to the joists by more than nails and time. When it finally cracked free, a draft of frigid air rushed up, carrying the smell of damp stone and earth. Beneath the boards, instead of the shallow crawl space they expected, there was darkness. A drop so deep the lantern light seemed to be swallowed before it reached the ground. Someone fetched rope. Someone else fetched more lanterns. The current pastor, pale and trembling but insistent on witnessing whatever lay beneath her church, watched silently as the volunteers widened the opening until it revealed the top of a staircase carved directly into stone. The staircase shouldn't have existed. The church had been rebuilt twice in the last century. No blueprints mentioned a sublevel. No town records acknowledged a basement or crypt beneath the foundation. Yet here it was, descending into the earth like an invitation. Or a warning. The first few steps were worn smooth, not by water or weather, but by footsteps, many footsteps, taken over many years. The stone bore a faint sheen, like polished bone. As the volunteers descended, their lanterns flickered violently, as though protesting the intrusion. The air grew colder, heavy with an unsettling dampness that clung to their skin. The staircase spiraled, not sharply but with a slow, deliberate curve that made it impossible to see what waited at the bottom until they were nearly upon it. When they finally reached the chamber, the entire group froze. They stood inside a vast circular room carved entirely from the bedrock. The ceiling arched impossibly high, supported by pillars etched with symbols that none of them recognized. The carvings weren't mere decorations, the patterns seemed to coil into each other, forming shapes that appeared to move subtly when viewed from the corner of the eye. The walls were lined with alcoves, each holding objects that appeared ancient beyond comprehension, dolls made of straw and twine, wooden masks with hollow eyes, lengths of rope knotted in intricate, ritualistic patterns. But it was the center of the room that stole their breath. There, arranged in precise rows, were 50 small wooden chairs. Each one was identical, carved from pale, almost colorless timber that had never seen varnish or paint. The chairs were child-sized, perfectly preserved despite the dampness of the underground air. Some had faint etchings on the legs, names, maybe, though the letters were written in a script that twisted in unfamiliar shapes. They were arranged as though waiting for the children to return and sit down, as though a class had been convened in the depths of the earth where the sun could never reach. The eerie stillness of the chairs was unbearable. They were not dusty or aged. They looked as though someone had placed them there that very morning. Behind the rows of chairs was a door. At first it appeared to be stone, but when one of the volunteers approached and raised his lantern, the material gleamed oddly. It was not stone, nor wood, nor metal. It was something else, something with a faintly reflective surface, like wet clay hardened into a smooth panel. Across the door's surface were symbols, hundreds of them, etched in lines that spiraled like vines, intersecting, overlapping, forming patterns that seemed to writhe when touched by light. The symbols resembled the ones found in the pastor's diary, the ones the Circle of Purity had worshipped, the ones associated with the rituals described in fragments of old lore. The door stood tall, stretching nearly to the arched ceiling, sealed without hinges or a visible lock, as though it had been fused into the stone by some ancient force. As the volunteers examined the door, a low vibration pulsed through the chamber floor. It was faint at first, like the tremor of distant footsteps, but then grew more pronounced, causing dust to drift from the ceiling and settle onto the chairs in a thin, shivering layer. Someone placed their palm against the door, and the symbols shifted beneath their touch, not moving like carvings would under pressure, but reshaping themselves as though reacting to warmth or skin. The volunteer yanked his hand back with a startled gasp, insisting the surface felt alive, like touching the flank of a sleeping animal. Lanterns flickered again, their flames shrinking as if the chamber were breathing them in. Then the whispers returned. Not from the chapel above, but from the stone chamber itself. They rose from the cracks between the floor tiles, from the etchings on the pillars, from the chairs arranged in patient rows. These whispers were different, closer, clearer, unmistakably the voices of children. Some laughed faintly, others called out names, others hummed hymns warped into eerie, off-key melodies. The volunteers stood frozen, no longer believing the whispers were tricks of exhaustion or echoes from the chapel. Down here, beneath the earth, the voices were too direct, too present, too aware. The sound swelled toward the sealed door, as if answering something on the other side, and the cymbals pulsed with dim light, responding like a heartbeat awakened from slumber.